Have you ever heard of a killer who calls the police to warn them about his next murder? It sounds like something straight out of a Hollywood movie. But this is a true story, and it's one of the most chilling cases in criminal history. This is the story of the weepy-voiced killer, Paul Michael Stefani. Our story begins in the early 1980s, in the Twin Cities area of Minnesota, Minneapolis, and St. Paul. The community was on edge. A series of brutal attacks on women had left everyone feeling unsafe. But what made this case truly bizarre were the phone calls. After each attack, a man would call the police. His voice was high-pitched, emotional, and filled with remorse. He would cry, sob, and beg the police to stop him. He'd say things like, "Please don't talk, just listen. I'm sorry for what I did. I'll never do it again." He couldn't control his own murderous urges, and his desperate calls earned him the nickname, the weepy-voiced killer. Let's go back to the very first incident linked to Stefani. On New Year's Eve 1980, a young woman named Karen Potak was brutally attacked in her home. She was left for dead, but miraculously, she survived. She couldn't identify her attacker, but she provided crucial details about the assault. Shortly after, the police received a strange, anonymous call. The caller, in a tearful voice, confessed to hurting the woman and begged for forgiveness. The police were baffled. Was this a genuine confession or a cruel prank? They didn't know it yet, but this was just the beginning of a terrifying pattern. Over the next 2 years, the attacks continued. In June 1981, a student named Kimberly Compton was found murdered. She had been stabbed with an ice pick. The community was horrified, and then the phone rang at the police station. It was him again, the weepy-voiced man. He was hysterical, crying uncontrollably. He gave details about the murder that only the killer could know. He wailed, "I'm sorry. I killed that girl. I stabbed her." He pleaded with the police to find him and stop him before he killed again. The call was traced, but the killer hung up before they could pinpoint his location. The police were in a nightmare scenario. They had a serial attacker who was taunting them, yet seemed to genuinely want to be caught. They released recordings of his calls to the public, hoping someone would recognize the strange, high-pitched, sobbing voice. The media went into a frenzy. The entire state was listening to the killer's cries, and fear gripped the Twin Cities. Everyone was asking the same question. Who is this man, and why can't he stop himself? A few months later, in August 1981, the killer struck again. Kathleen Greening, a nurse, was found drowned in her bathtub. It was a vicious, personal attack. And just like clockwork, the weepy-voiced killer called the police. This time, he was even more frantic. He confessed to drowning Kathleen and once again begged to be stopped. He told the dispatcher, "I'll try not to kill anybody else." The word "try" sent shivers down everyone's spines. It was clear this man was a deeply disturbed individual, caught in a cycle of violence and remorse that he couldn't break. The investigation was one of the largest in Minnesota's history. Detectives worked around the clock, chasing down every lead. They analyzed the calls, created psychological profiles, and interviewed hundreds of people. The killer seemed to be a ghost, always one step ahead. He knew details about the crime scenes that hadn't been released to the public, confirming the calls were legitimate. But his voice was his only real clue, and it wasn't enough to identify him. Then, for almost a year, the calls stopped. The attacks ceased. The city began to breathe a collective sigh of relief. Maybe the killer had moved away, or maybe he'd finally gotten control of his demons. But the peace was shattered in April 1982. A 21-year-old woman named Denise Williams was viciously attacked and murdered. This time, the weapon was a screwdriver. The brutality was escalating. And then came the call. But something was different. The voice was still high-pitched, but it wasn't weepy. It was angry. He yelled at the dispatcher, "You ain't gonna find me." The remorse seemed to be gone, replaced by rage and defiance. It was a terrifying evolution. But after this call, the line went silent again. No more attacks, no more A-calls. The case went cold. The weepy-voiced killer vanished as mysteriously as he had appeared. The mystery would remain unsolved until August 1982. A young woman named Barbara Simons was offered a ride by a friendly man. But once she was in his car, his demeanor changed. He attacked her, stabbing her repeatedly with a screwdriver. But Barbara was a fighter. She fought back with incredible courage, managed to escape the car, and screamed for help. Passersby rushed to her aid, and her attacker, bleeding from the struggle, fled the scene. This time, the killer made a fatal mistake. Barbara Simons survived, and she had seen her attacker's face. More importantly, he was injured and had left a trail. He went to a local hospital for treatment for his wounds. An alert hospital worker noticed his injuries were suspicious and that he matched the description of the attacker. They called the police. When officers arrived, they found Paul Michael Stephanie. At first, Stephanie denied everything. He claimed he'd been robbed and stabbed, but the evidence against him was overwhelming. Barbara Simons identified him as her attacker, but was he the weepy-voiced killer? He didn't have a high-pitched voice. He sounded like a regular guy. The police were skeptical. They had the man who attacked Barbara, but was he the man behind the infamous calls? The breakthrough came when investigators looked into Stephanie's background. They discovered something shocking. Stephanie suffered from a rare condition that caused his voice to become high-pitched and strained when he was under extreme emotional distress. When he was calm, his voice was normal, but when he was agitated, anxious, or, say, confessing to a murder, his voice would transform into the one the entire state had heard on the radio. It was the perfect, chilling explanation. Confronted with this, and the mountain of evidence, Stephanie's story began to crumble. He was convicted for the attack on Barbara Simons and the murder of Denise Williams. He was sentenced to decades in prison, but he still didn't confess to the other crimes. 4 years, he maintained his innocence regarding the murders of Kimberly Compton and Kathleen Greening. The full truth didn't come out until 1997, 15 years later. Stephanie was dying of cancer in prison. Perhaps facing his own mortality, he decided to finally come clean. He confessed to everything. He admitted to killing Kimberly Compton, Kathleen Greening, and to the initial attack on Karen Pye. He even confessed to another murder that police hadn't connected to him. He was the weepy-voiced killer. His confession gave the victims' families some closure, but it left behind a haunting psychological puzzle. Why did he call the police? Was his remorse genuine? Or was it a twisted part of his ritual, a way to get attention and relive his crimes? Psychologists who studied the case believe it was a combination of both. Stephanie likely felt a genuine, albeit fleeting, sense of guilt after his violent outbursts. The calls were his way of trying to purge that guilt, but they were also a cry for help from a man who knew he was a monster but didn't know how to stop. The case of Paul Michael Stephanie, the weepy-voiced killer, remains one of the most unique and disturbing in the annals of true crime. It's a story about the duality of human nature, the darkness that can hide behind a normal facade, and the chilling reality that sometimes the monster knows it's a monster and is just as afraid as everyone else. It serves as a stark reminder that the human mind is a complex and often terrifying place. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this story as fascinating as I did, please hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the most compelling true crime cases. Let me know in the comments what you think about the weepy-voiced killer. Was his remorse real? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Stay safe, and I'll see you in the next video.